Every day, we get more data about how the virus is transmitting and hitting people in the U.S. The clearer it becomes that existing social inequalities, especially racial ones, are amplifying its effects. In transmission, in fatalities, in economics, all these things have been pried wide open by this disease. I've been texting throughout this crisis with my friend Ta-nehisi Coates, and I really wanted to talk to him on air about all this and all this in this surreal moment. And joining me now is author and journalist Ta-nehisi Coates. You know, Ta-Nehisi, I think when people talk about, the abstract of racism or segregation or the history of racial oppression or white supremacy, things like that, people are like, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? And I think someone wrote this, and I'm not going to get the citation right, but like the fatality rates here, the disproportionate fatality rates, the life expectancy changes, like that's as concrete empirical reality about what that means as anything.
Yeah, no, you're seeing it. I mean, it's right in front of you. And I would suspect that anybody who has any sort of grounding, in the history of this country, in the long history of white supremacy in this country, in where Black people have existed in the hierarchy of this country, is not particularly surprised. It is as though you had a building and you had a group of people who were living on the first floor and in the basement, and then the waves came in. One cannot be shocked that they're going to be affected in a certain kind of way, as opposed to other people who live on other levels of the building. But Chris, I think it's important, even as we know that, to understand that this will not be a Black-only disease. That's not really how America works, and it's not how racism works. Black people bear a disproportionate brunt of it and will, but I think it's really, really important to emphasize that white people won't get away either. There's always pressure to view certain things as, diseases of certain groups of people, or to focus on individual behaviors, et cetera. And I just want to head that off before we even go in that direction, while noting the disproportionate effect and making it clear that it's the result of historical processes.
That's such an important point, too, because one of the lessons here, right, is that like, there's two truths here. One is that there's a disproportionate effect among certain communities, particularly people, frontline workers, people in African Americans, people who have pre-existing comorbidities, which are linked to all that. The other is that the virus doesn't care. It doesn't care about borders. Right. It doesn't care about, what neighborhood you're like. It'll spread. It'll get there. Like it'll be in Albany, Georgia, and it'll be in Montana, and it'll be in Ecuador, and it'll be on the Upper East Side, and it'll be like, and both of those things are true at the same time. But that latter part about there's a part of that binds us all together is, I think you're right, important not to lose.
Yeah, I mean, the virus doesn't care. It's us who cares. America cares. The virus, you're absolutely correct about that. The virus is colorblind. We are not. And the way the virus plays out is according to, how things have always played. I mean, this is no different than the housing crisis, for instance. In the wake of the housing crisis, the anemic response to that crisis, certainly Black people suffered a disproportionate loss of wealth. But you can go through all this country and find that white America was not spared. We just got hit harder, but that doesn't mean that white people won't get hit. And so I think like there's tension, right? You have to hold both of those things at the same time.
And it's also, there's something deeper than that, too, in the policy structures that we erect, because what ends up happening is so many concerns in American policy debates, which get sort of run through this lens of special favors for those people. Oh, you're going to give, special money to those people. If you fund the cities, we all know what that means. That ends up being an obstacle to universal programs, things that would end up helping everyone, right? Like, there are all kinds of universal programs in this moment. If anyone could get health care and everyone had insurance, would probably be better for everyone, no matter who you are. And yet that particularism and the legacies of that are part of what bring us to this point where it's hard to sell Americans on that.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And so that's why I think it's really important to talk about it in that way, and, kind of going in another direction. But again, holding this tension, I really, think it's important to understand that and to restate, although, I know folks get tired of me saying it, I get tired of saying it, that this moment originates in white supremacy. The beginning of this long epic is Donald Trump's flirtation with birtherism. That just has to be said. It's, calling, a judge a Mexican. That's the political origination of it. It's playing out throughout it. It's not being lost in it. The insistence on calling COVID-19 the Wuhan virus and literally protesting world institutions unless it's labeled the Wuhan virus. The focus on New York City, the John Rocker-like focus on New York City as somehow the place that's poisoning the rest of the country. It's all right there. The right-wing identitarianism of it is still with us, and it's been with us from the origin, and it's playing out right now, too.
It's also true that I've been thinking about this a lot. I mean, one of the things we've learned here as we've gotten the reporting about the response from the White House was there was this move to shut down travel from China. And if you look at the record of the president talking about it, it was like, well, problem solved, right? If all you have is a wall, everything looks like an invasion. It was like, well, we shut down China. This is a Chinese thing. We don't have them coming from China anymore. By the way, that was not true. There was actually tons of travel coming in from China. But that itself gave this false sense of security precisely because he and the people around him are so devoted to thinking of the world in those terms.
Yeah, and it's deeply dangerous. I mean, it's deeply, deeply dangerous. As we started this conversation, I was saying, obviously a disproportionate number of African Americans are going to, pay for that era. But some of Donald Trump's supporters are also going to pay for that era, too. And this is how the history has always been. Unfortunately, there have been folks in this country, a critical mass, not necessarily all, and sometimes not even most, of white people who have been willing to pay the cost in order, as long as, there's somebody else below them who've also, paid the cost. And I think we're just seeing that play out right now.
I wonder how you've been thinking about this, the sort of magnitude of this crisis. I mean, it's striking to think about in the last, say, 20 years, and particularly a generation slightly younger than you and I have sort of come of age. But I mean, between 9/11, the Iraq War, and then the worst financial crisis in 70 years in the Great Recession, and now the worst pandemic since 1918, but also something that almost doesn't really have a good, close analog, the sheer amount of disaster, institutional breakdown that we've witnessed in a short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's historic. It's really, really historic. And for my money, as I said, this moment has its origins in the fact that a certain sector of the country simply couldn't bear the idea of a black president and was willing to sacrifice the sanctity of all of its institutions. And for 3 years, folks skated on that, and they got away. And every second we thought, oh, is this the moment? Is this the moment? Is this the moment? And I'm not saying this is the moment that necessarily brings Trump down. I wouldn't be surprised if he were reelected, again in the fall. But the bill comes due eventually. And it's sad, but I think those of us, who have, some root and grounding in history are not at all surprised.
Yeah, the bill coming due. It's been really difficult to watch that bill coming due. Ta-Nehisi Coates.
It has. Yeah.
Great to talk to you, man.
All right. Thank you, Chris.